If you read the story of Moses, it begins by narrating how after he was born, his mother saved him by placing him in a reed basket and floating him down the Nile. He was discovered by an Egyptian princess who raised him in the palace. However, this story actually sounds similar to the birth story of Sargon of Akkad. After Sargon was born, his mother placed him in a reed basket in a river, where he was rescued by an irrigator named Aki, who raised him as his son. He later became king because of the favor of the goddess Ishtar. Many scholars have argued the similarities are enough to draw a connection and suggest the story of Moses borrowed from the Sargon birth legend. Mark Lucher says, "It is well known that this tale draws from the very similar tale of Sargon of Akkad, which signals that the biblical tale was composed during the late 8th through 7th centuries BCE, since the Sargon tale was composed during the reign of Sargon II. Martin Noth said, "When Sargon was born, he was put by his unnamed mother in a little box, made of reeds and sealed with pitch, and was then sent afloat on the Euphrates. It can hardly be doubted that such stories were known in the world of ancient Israel and had their effect on the development of the story of the birth of Moses." If this is true, it would mean a key element of the story of Moses was a later mythic invention and not an historical account. However, we need to remember correlation is not causation. There are numerous differences between these two stories, and merely cherry-picking out the similarities is not enough to suggest literary dependence. The story of Sargon's birth comes from an Assyrian text from the Library of Nineveh, and most scholars date it to sometime in the first half of the first millennium BC, and it most likely dates to the reign of Sargon II, who reigned from 722 to 705 BC. Sargon of Akkad died in the 23rd century BC, which places the composition of this story over 1,500 years from the events it describes. We argued elsewhere, there is good evidence that much of the Pentateuch predates the 8th century BC, so we have good reasons to believe the story of Moses predates the composition of this story. But let's set that aside and assume the story of Sargon is older. Should we believe the story of Moses borrowed from this legend? To begin, it's important to note that there are similarities between the two accounts. In both, the parents are left unnamed. Moses' parents are named later in the Pentateuch, but not in the birth story. Both come from a priestly lineage through their mother. Both mothers give birth in secret. The fathers are mentioned briefly. Both mothers place their child in a reed basket, lined with pitch, and both are rescued from a river, adopted by strangers, and come under female guardianship. Moses becomes the son of an Egyptian princess, and Sargon is shown favor by Ishtar. Both are also compared to drawn water. Moses' Hebrew name is said to come from the phrase, "out of water I drew him." And the Sargon birth legend says, "Aki, drawer of water, brought me up." Both receive apprenticeships. Sargon works in an orchard, and Moses later becomes a shepherd in Midian. And both receive a divine election and rise to lead their people. The similarities are interesting and deserve attention, but it should be clear to anyone familiar with both stories, I have stretched several to draw connections. The parents being unnamed is common in ancient stories, where they play a minor role, and Moses' parents are named later in Exodus in a genealogy. Moses is not from a lineage that was of priests yet. The Levites did not receive their divine appointment until after the Exodus. Sargon's mother's lineage is not mentioned. She was only said to be a high priestess. Sargon was also most likely conceived through some illicit fashion, which was probably the reason she had to hide her baby. Moses' mother was married and hid Moses to protect him from the Egyptians, who wanted all the Hebrew male babies slaughtered. Moses' father only phased from the story because he was no longer relevant, whereas in the legend Sargon says he had no idea who his father was. Sargon was also rescued by an irrigator and not raised by royalty, whereas Moses was rescued by a princess and raised as her son. The aspect of female guardianship is also completely different. One is Moses' adopted mother, and the other is a goddess, who would be more comparable to the Lord. who is not mentioned in the birth narrative of Moses. The aspect of them being compared to drawn water is totally different. Their apprenticeships are also different and happen at entirely different times in their lives. And their stories of divine election are also different. Sargon becomes king, and Moses only leads the Israelites out of Egypt without becoming a king. Tremper Longman adds, "The Moses story narrates that the infant was nursed in an unusual manner. The role of Moses' sister is unparalleled in the Sargon birth legend. Moses is hidden for 3 months before exposure. Moses is exposed because of a threat to his life from Pharaoh. The Sargon birth legend does not state the reason for Sargon's exposure, though it may be speculated that Sargon's mother, being a priestess, was prohibited from bearing children. Moses' name is etymologically connected with the exposure event, whereas Sargon is not. Additionally, we can add that the Sargon account is written in first person, whereas the narrative of Moses is in third person." Longman says, "Thus, while there is a definite similarity between Exodus 2 and the Sargon birth legend, the differences in detail between them caution against a too easy identification of the two, and against the idea that the Moses story is borrowed directly from Akkadian literature. The similarities drawn between the two stories are actually of a general nature. In reality, the only striking similarity is that both are placed in reed baskets lined with pitch and sent down a river. We must ask, if the writer of Exodus 2 was borrowing from the Sargon birth legend, why did he only take this element? Why not have Moses raised by an irrigator and work in an orchard? Why not have his mother be a priestess, or at least work in a temple? The only striking similarity is the basket element. Now, this may sound unusual to us today, but not so in the ancient world. First off, as scholars have pointed out, the exposure of infants was common, especially to avoid the shame of a birth out of wedlock, or when people were living under extreme and harsh conditions. Donald Redford identified 32 known stories of child exposure from the ancient Near East. He then divided them into 3 categories. The first is when a child is exposed due to shameful circumstances. The second is a king or powerful figure tries to kill a child who poses a threat to his dynasty. And the third is that a massacre is introduced that threatens the life of the child along with others. Redford places the Sargon birth legend in the first, and the story of Moses in the third, so they're in entirely different categories. Additionally, he provides a list of all the stories, and notes being left in a river or on a river bank occurs in 10. 5 specifically mention a basket, and another 5 mention similar carrying devices. Given how these types of stories are found throughout the ancient world, this suggests that such an act was a common practice, and probably did occur often, which gave rise to these stories, rather than one borrowing from another. Infants were often exposed, and rivers were a common place to do so, as Joshua Berman says. The ubiquity of the motif suggests that it is rooted in a social reality. It is not uncommon for us today to hear news reports of infants abandoned near a garbage dumpster or at the entrance of a hospital emergency room. Infants are abandoned at locations where they will be noticed and hopefully cared for. In ancient times, no site was more the focus of day-to-day activity in riverine cultures than the riverbank, where the chances were greatest that a child would be noticed and saved. So given that infant exposure was common in the ancient world, and that both Egypt and Mesopotamia were cultures that revolved around rivers, we would expect that many infants were left in objects in rivers or on river banks. This social reality gave rise to many stories, like the Moses and Sargon stories. And when these stories began tragically, but ended in salvation or a rise to prominence, people were more likely to remember them and write them down. As Douglas Stewart says, as is usually the case, social realities give birth to literary motifs, not the other way around. What happened to Moses being exposed to save his life was the sort of thing that happened regrettably, often in history. Leslie J. Hoppy says, though these parallels are engaging, the author of Exodus may not have known of the legend about Sargon's birth. It is clear, however, that the biblical writer was using a common literary motif to describe the ascent to greatness of a person of humble birth. Given this, there is no reason to assume the story of Moses is a fictional account that draws from the Sargon birth legend. correlation is not causation. Given the amount of differences between the two accounts, it is unlikely the author of Exodus 2 simply took one element from this Sargon legend and changed the rest for unexplained reasons. Given the cultural background, both stories could have an historical basis. As Brian Lewis said, one should at least consider the possibility that in the case of Sargon, or any of the other historical heroes, the popular narrative may have been based on some historical fact. Following this logic, we can say the same about Moses' birth. It could simply have been an historical event that took place, and given the rags to riches motif, people were more likely to remember this aspect of Moses' life and highlight it in the book of Exodus. The same could be true for Sargon. Thus, there is no reason to assume the story of Moses borrowed from the Sargon birth legend. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.